In this lesson, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about evaluating sources. So, in this class, obviously, we want to talk about what happened in the modern world. We want to talk about some of the big themes and issues and like why those are happening. So, that's like the knowledge piece. But the other thing I want you to get are some skills that you can use when you hear current events, regardless of the ones we're talking about in class or other things going on, to really think critically about what you're hearing and evaluate the sources that you're reading and what's being told to you and what isn't being told to you. And is it something you can trust or not? So we're going to develop those skills over the course of this year. We're actually going to use an acronym to think about things critically. But before we jump into that with your next assignment, what I want to do is talk a little bit about just some basic vocabulary that I think is really, really helpful, both for your assignment and for you, and just kind of recognizing some of the basic things to look for and think about when you see a source. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this idea of when we talk about sources, bias and accuracy. I think that like when teachers tend to talk to you about evaluating sources, sometimes we make this job really difficult because a lot of times we teach this like, well, there are good sources and there are bad sources, or like there are biased ones or not biased ones. And that is true. There are definitely biased news sources out there. And there are definitely sources that are not telling the truth out there. But the reality is those two things are actually very different concepts. So I want you to take just maybe 10 seconds here or 30 seconds here to think about like, what do you think bias means and what do you think accuracy means and how might those be different? So maybe you can pause the video for just like 30 seconds here and try to come up with the definition, and I'm going to tell you what I think they mean. So hopefully you've had a chance to think about those a little bit. Bias. So what we mean when we say bias is like, what are the things that you tend to favor? Every single person has biases. There's no way you can totally get rid of your biases. You definitely should be aware of your own biases. You definitely should be aware of the biases of everyone, including myself. So what we mean when we talk about this is like, you have certain ideas, principles, groups, people that you tend to favor. Sometimes you do this intentionally, sometimes you do this unintentionally. And so those can be both good and bad, but the important thing is to mostly just be aware that everybody has these. So a news source can be biased, and all news sources are biased. Some are more biased than others, yet nonetheless there are biases in each source, and you need to be able to recognize these. So accuracy, though, is different than that. So accuracy is not just what do you favor, but it's more about like, do the things that you present add up? Are they true? Are you giving factual information, or are you making up the things, or are you fabricating the things, or are you lying about the things that you're telling us? So think of this as like the evidence that you're presenting, okay? So I would say like bias is like, what's the overall picture that you're trying to paint for us? And I would say that accuracy is like, what evidence are you using, and is that evidence true to like paint that picture? Okay, so let me give you a really quick example of both bias and accuracy. Maybe you can try to think about in this little example that I'm giving you where the bias is and where the accuracy is. So I could tell you, look, here's the deal. Social studies classes are the most important class that you will ever take. Here's the reason why. In social studies classes, we talk about the Constitution, we talk about what your rights are, and you have to know what your rights are. If you don't know what your rights are, then there's no chance that you have for protecting yourself for people trying to violate those rights. So obviously, we are the most important class. Okay, so what I just told you, there was bias in there, and then we can also talk about the accuracy of that. So the bias in there was what? Obviously, I'm going to tell you that social studies classes are the most important classes. Why? Because I'm a social studies teacher. If I did not think that social studies classes were the most important classes, then I would not be teaching social studies to you. So obviously, I'm going to say that. That's my own personal bias. Now, in terms of the accuracy thing, what I told you was accurate, right? Like, we do tell you about the Constitution, and it is true that you need to know what your rights are, and it is true that if you don't know what your rights are, then you don't know how to protect them. So like, I painted you an accurate picture. I just intentionally painted that picture for you so that you would think, oh yes, of course, social studies classes are the most important classes. What I didn't do was put anything in that picture about any other subject area. So obviously my English teaching colleagues would disagree with me. I didn't consider any of the factors about why an English class might be important. So that's an example of bias. I've just left that out of my picture, intentionally so. But what I told you wasn't inaccurate. I just left certain things out. So all news stories, all sources, all videos, like all of those things are going to intentionally include things and intentionally leave things out. And you just need to know about how to recognize those things and think about those things. So that's what we're going to work on. Okay, so the next big piece of vocabulary that you need to know, in addition to bias and accuracy, are three other important things. Before we get to those things, though, I want to show you just one really quick example of bias and accuracy that I think is kind of cool to think about when you are evaluating a source. Okay, so that thing looks like this. So, this is some organization that's made this media bias chart. I don't know if I buy everything that's in here or not. Regardless, there's some really cool things in here that I think are helpful for us when we're thinking about bias and accuracy, what I was just telling you. So oftentimes when we talk about media, we talk about like how far to the left it is, or how liberal it is, or how conservative it is. And that's true. That is one thing you definitely need to think about. However, in addition to that, there's also like, do the things that they report, do they tend to be true or do they tend to be not true? How opinion-based are they versus how just here's what happened based are they? And so I think this chart does a really good job. So every single news source that they looked at, they selected a sample of articles and said how reliable they thought the facts in the article were. And so they gave them a spot up or down. And then they also put them like, so do they tend to talk about things that are more liberal things? Do they tend to talk about things that are more conservative things? And so they also gave them a spot right or left. So anyways, I thought this kind of way to view them as not just on the right and left scale of being liberal or conservative, but also on the more fact-based versus less fact-based is a really good way or tool for you to think about anytime that you look at a source. Okay, so enough of that. So let's talk next about three other things that you're definitely going to have to identify in the assignment and throughout the year when we evaluate sources. Okay, so it's really important for you to identify the publisher, the author, and then sources in anything that you're looking at. Okay, so let's talk about each one. So the publisher is like who published this, who put it out there, who printed it, who is the website that's hosting this thing. The author is who wrote or created this thing. So obviously if it's an article, like someone wrote that article, someone wrote the words that are on the screen. If it's a video, like someone made that thing. Who is the person or group that made that thing? So with both publisher and author, once you can identify who those are, then you can start going through and looking at like, okay, well, what other things do they publish or what other things do they write? Where do their biases lie? Again, just because someone is biased doesn't necessarily mean that what they're writing is good or bad. You just need to be able to identify that so you can think about, okay, well, what picture would this person be trying to paint for me? And then what other things should I consider as I'm making up my own mind about this thing that I'm looking at? So then the very last thing that's also a helpful tool for that, regardless who the author is and regardless what their biases are, and this might be one helpful way to identify biases, is like, who are the sources that they use? So if I'm going to write an article or if I'm going to make a video, like obviously I'm going to be putting evidence in that video for you. So the question is, where am I getting my evidence? So if it's like quotes, like who are the quotes from? Who are the people that I'm quoting? And super important, like who are the people that I'm not quoting? If I'm giving you facts and figures, where do those facts and figures come from? Can you find other places that have those facts and figures? So these are all things that we're going to try to do throughout the year and some of the skills that we're going to practice doing. So super quick, let me walk you through how to identify these and also some tools to start thinking about and digging in a little bit deeper at the publisher, author, and sources. Okay, so I'm going to show you two different articles here. Okay, so here's an article. This article is posted here. It's about comparing affordability of living in Houston and New York. It's just a random article that I picked. All right, so when we look at this article, who is the publisher for this article? The publisher for this article would be the website that it's on, which is this, like Texas Monthly. And so, one of my questions is, have you ever heard of Texas Monthly? I mean, maybe you have, but my guess is you probably haven't, living here in Nebraska. And so what can you do if you want to find out more about Texas Monthly? Is this like a for real magazine or like is it just like some random site? So click on it. Open it up in another tab. So you notice I open this up in another tab. Multi-tabbed browsing, opening several things up that you can look at once is really key for evaluating sources. Okay, so here I am on the homepage. So first I can just start like looking through the things and types of articles that they post. Another really important section is all websites should have an About Us section, so you can find out about that organization. Oftentimes they'll be posted up here at the top. Not often though on like news websites. So on a news website, or if you can't find it at the top, you can scroll all the way down to the bottom. And in the bottom, you can see this little About Us tab. So if you click on About Us, here it like walks you through a little bit of the history of this magazine, okay? And then like this gives you all these different pieces of information. You can actually check these things. Was it founded in this year? Is this the guy who actually founded the magazine? Like these are all things that you can look up to see if they're accurate. And also like this will give you a sense of what the purpose of the magazine is or the group is, and some tools to think about that. Okay, so that's who the publisher is and how you might find that. So now we'll go back to our article. All right, who's the author then? So Texas Monthly is who published it, but then the author was written by this guy, Peter Hawley. And I don't know anything about Peter Hawley, so how could I find out about Peter Hawley? Well, two things. One, I could just Google him, not a bad idea, and see what other things he's written. Plus, most news sites, you can click on the person's name. When you hover over it, the little hand appears, and then you can open up a page. And so this will tell you about Peter Hawley. A lot of times it'll have a little bio. It looks like it doesn't here, but it can at least give you an idea of like what kinds of things that he writes about, as well as like a contact information. That's really huge as well. You want to be reading things of people who are like, yeah, email me about what I wrote. Okay, so that's identifying this when it's in a form like this. Identifying things like author and publisher. Let's talk a little bit about what about a YouTube video? Students will cite YouTube videos all the time. So here's just a random YouTube video that I pulled up about one of the youngest Nobel Prize recipients. And so if I have this video, who's the publisher for this video? YouTube is the publisher or platform where this video is hosted. They're allowing someone else to put it on there. So YouTube did not create this video. You would not cite YouTube as like where the video came from. That's where it's hosted. The group that put this video up and created it is actually down here, the Malala Fund. So if you want to find out more about the Malala Fund, again, highly recommend open up another tab in your web browser, another window, and like look up the Malala Fund. What can you find out about them? Also, pretty much all YouTube users, if you click on that, you can see their channel, all right? So look at some of the other things that they've published. That gives you an idea about what their focus is on. Also, once again, hey, look, here's an About section. And just like with our previous source, this gives you some things that you can start checking on to see, are these things true, and is this an organization that works for what I'm trying to look at? Okay, so hopefully that gives you a few ideas about some of the key things that you'll need to look at this year. At this point, you should be able to talk about the difference between bias and accuracy, and how they might influence the way that you view a certain piece of information, and then also be able to easily identify and start thinking about publishers, authors, and the sources that they use.